Well, hello, Destiny. How are you today?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. I'm so excited to have you on. I've been following you on social media for a while because I think I don't even remember how I found you, but I've been following you and I love what you post. And with school coming up, I'm like, I need to see if I can get her on the podcast. So it was so fun when I reached out and you're like, I'm the person that you need to talk to get me on your podcast. It's like,
Yes,
yay.
I love that. You made me feel so special because
Oh,
I told my husband, I was like, yeah, she was like, who do I talk to get you on the phone? I was like, just
me?
me, just me.
Well, that was so nice. And I appreciate you being willing to come on and give me an hour of your time. But before we jump in, can you just introduce yourself to everybody?
Yes, I am Destiny Huff. I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm in the mental health field and I'm a special education parent advocate, and I'm currently located in Georgia.
So I know nothing about Georgia other than, isn't Georgia peach? Is that the
Yes, Georgia
something?
Peach. So my husband's family and my family are both from Georgia, but
Oh,
my dad was actually in the military. So
okay.
I was born in Germany,
Oh,
and I have been around as far as like where I've lived, and I spent actually most of my life in Germany before
okay.
becoming an adult. And my husband's currently in the military, so right now we're stationed in Georgia.
Okay. Got it. But you've moved quite a bit, right? You
Mm-hmm.
said, okay, so tell me, out of all the places you've lived, what has been your favorite?
Oh, Germany.
Really?
Yes, we lived in Germany. My dad was stationed in Germany, I want to say like 5 times.
Okay.
And so I went to, at one point, I went to elementary school, middle school, and high school in Germany.
Okay. So
Yeah.
why you didn't even hesitate? Why didn't you not even hesitate to say Germany? What is it?
The food,
Okay.
the climate during the time, it was very much like you could go catch the bus and go downtown, and
Mm,
very safe environment, I guess. And I think it's because we were military, so we were located on the base
hmm.
a lot of the time. And some of our friends lived off the base. But I mean, for sure, the food, the culture, knowing that, you could play sports and go cross into another country.
Oh my
So
gosh.
we'd be in
Yeah.
Germany and we would play like the Spain team in
Oh my
football.
gosh.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Wow. Yeah, I have not ever left the United States. Oh no, I lied. I went to Canada once when I was a kid. So I always love to hear other people like living vicariously through you guys when I hear your stories. I'm like, that's so cool. I'm so
Yes.
boring.
No, but I always think I'm always glad like the military gave us that opportunity, because when you're over there too, they set up like trips. They would set up trips and stuff to go into other, like take bus trips to other countries and things like that.
Hmm.
And but my husband's career, he's has a different job in the military, so we haven't had like that opportunity. And so our goal is to get our kids over there.
Hmm.
But I've been over there and he's been over there, but our goal
Okay.
is to get them over there. So
Because you both love it. So that would make sense. Yes. Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about actually before we talk, because we're going to talk a lot about IEPs today with school coming up. That is the bulk of what our conversation is going to be. But I do want to have you share a little bit about you are a certified trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapist.
yes. Yes, it's a mouthful.
Yeah. And this podcast is all about trauma awareness and how do we be more trauma aware, and whether we're parents, caregivers, teachers, coaches, whatever. And so this is one modality that we haven't talked about on here. And so I don't want that to be the focus of our time together, but can you talk about like, what do you do do you just say CB?
Yeah,
Do you
see,
say the whole thing?
so we could just say TFCBT. So I'm
Okay.
certified in TFCBT.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So
And
what do you do?
TFCBT is the trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapist. So that certification was originally created for therapists who work with children.
Okay.
And it was because of the constant trauma they were seeing in children and adolescents, as far as neglect and abuse, witnessing domestic violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and again, neglect.
Hmm.
And so they created that training because they were noticing that they needed more individuals to be trained in addressing trauma with children,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not, typically old school therapy is talk therapy, right? You
Yeah.
just talk it out. So
Yeah.
you can expect a traumatized child to just talk it out with you.
Yeah.
So you have to get creative and find ways in that. So they created a program specifically to train clinicians in for a certification they can do to do that. And part of that is you have to attend this live in-person training for it's 3 or 4 days. Then you actually have to have like what's called a supervisor, and it's kind of like a group, and you have to process like these test cases, but you actually have to be
Oh,
doing therapy with children
sure.
experiencing trauma.
Yep.
And then you have to staff it. You have to use specific assessment tools to show that you're gauging this. And then you have to take a test. So
Mm-hmm.
once you finish
Okay.
that period of supervision, then you have to take a test. And then once you do that, you're certified for, I want to say I'll be going on, I think it's 4 years, 4 or 5 years, and then you do your recertification, which is a
Sure.
test to make sure you're up to date on the techniques.
Sure. Okay.
Um, so through COVID, they've had a lot of transitions with it where they started providing us how do you do TFCBT virtually.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and then they have specific areas. So they have, if you work with children and adolescents that have experienced sexual exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
here's a manual on how to do it from that standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
If you work with Black children or BIPOC children that have experienced racial trauma,
Mm-hmm.
here is one on that.
Oh,
If you work
wow.
with foster care
Yeah.
children,
Yep.
here's one on that. If you
Yeah.
work with children that are specifically in facilities, here's one on that. So they
Mm-hmm.
they made it so that there's different ones. If you work with military children, the specific type of traumas they can experience,
Mm-hmm.
here's one on that. So what we basically do is we have this approach where it's considered as 12 sessions, but it
Okay.
depends on the child's trauma. The child is really the one that identifies the trauma that speaks to them the most, because they could have experienced multiple traumas, or you could address all of them. And the big pieces are safety, education, having them address emotions, feelings, and thoughts that are
Mm-hmm.
connected to the trauma they experienced, and then having them process their story.
Okay.
So, them say what happened to them, but you helping them put it in the correct context. And what that
Yeah.
means is when we experience trauma, we tend to have what I call, and all my clients who listen to this will know, I call it a trauma brain.
Yeah.
And what that means is we a lot of times place the blame of the trauma on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the correct context of the story is maybe them saying, well, if I wouldn't have did this, this happened. And us helping them reframe it and remember,
Yep.
no, that's not the case. So then they'll tell the story and they'll say, well, this happened to me because they chose to do this
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
And then we process those feelings. And at the end of it, they tell their story in any way they want. They could draw it, they could do it in song, they can write a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell it to the non-offending caregiver. So they have somebody that's also going through this education with them and
Okay.
learning about trauma and
I love
learning how
that.
trauma has
I love that.
impacted
Okay. Cool.
people like them. And they tell their story, and that's the completion of their services through the TFCBT modality.
Okay. So if someone is listening to this and thinking like this might be a good option for my child or even for themselves, how do you find, what would they do?
So they can go to tfcbt.org.
Okay.
So that is actually where you locate certified TFCBT therapists. So
Okay.
like I'm listed on that directory, and they'll have it by state. So you can
Okay.
say I'm in this state. So if you want to do in-person services or virtual services, that clinician's name will be on that website.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I just didn't want to skip over that because I do think that that is also important work that you do. And I want to make sure that people know about it. So, okay. So let's talk IEPs, shall we?
Yes.
Okay. So I am so surprised and I don't know why, But I'm so surprised that so many of the clients that I work with, I do a lot of parent coaching, don't know about IEPs, what they
Mhm,
are, that they can ask for them, or even 504s. Like not everybody
mhm,
qualifies for an IEP, but
right,
even 504s, they don't know about that. And so I find myself oftentimes educating the families I'm working with on what they are and how they can get that started. Um, and so I think that's why I love the work you do, because that's what you do. Like, it's
right.
not like, oh, and also part of my work is like, that's what you do. And so, um, I just would love to know, first of all, how, when you have somebody that you come across, it's like, what's an IEP or what's a 504? How do you explain that to them?
So, how I explain it to them is that if your child has a diagnosis or a disability that impacts them in the school setting,
Hmm.
then they may qualify for a 504 or an IEP.
Okay.
The reason I explain it that way is because you'll have a lot of parents that'll say, well, my child has anxiety or my child even is diagnosed with autism.
Hmm.
And they'll say that and they'll say, so they should automatically get an IEP and 504. And I'm
Mm,
like, no, that's not how it works,
okay.
because you have to go through the school's assessment process and they have to determine via the assessments that it's having an impact on your child's education
Okay.
for them to qualify for a 504 or an IEP.
Okay. So can you explain what the difference is between an IEP and a 504?
Yes. So a 504 is for accommodations. It means that your child may need some accommodations, which are, let's say, are modifications. So that means like maybe they need their homework chunked, which means that they're not given, or modified, which means they're given an assignment that focuses on the same thing that their classmates are learning, but
Hmm.
it's not as extensive. So instead of a 2-page paper, they only have to write a 1-page paper. Okay. So it's making adjustments to
Okay.
accommodate their diagnosis. But an IEP is when they need a specific individualized program,
Okay.
which means that the child may need services, they may need accommodations, modifications, they may need time in different settings. So, one is an individualized program that is necessary for the entirety of that educational time, which could be their entire time in school,
Hmm. Hmm.
or just those first initial grades, whatever the time is. When a 504 is just, we're going to add some additional supports because this child is struggling, but they don't need their entire educational program individualized.
Got it. Okay. So, do you have to have a diagnosis for either IEP or 504?
So there's also a difference with that. So there's a
Okay.
difference between having a medical diagnosis
Yep.
and a school diagnosis.
Okay.
Okay. So let's say that your child is diagnosed with autism and they go through the special education process medically, and
Yeah.
they go through the special education process and they identify that they have problems with dysregulation.
Okay.
When the child is dysregulated, that's when we're talking about maybe they are getting overwhelmed, they're getting
Hmm.
overstimulated, they're
Hmm.
having these big responses, so they need supports. So the school might say, this is what is causing them issues. And so they're at the age where we would classify this as a social emotional developmental delay.
Sure.
So their IEP could be for social emotional developmental delay when their medical diagnosis is autism.
Got it.
So every state and district, they have what the criteria that would classify your child for a diagnosis per their IEP or 504.
Okay. So pause right there. It's per state, per district.
Yes.
Okay.
So, like for instance, recently in North Carolina, they made it so that a specific sensory assessment has to be done in order for a child to qualify for the autism diagnosis in the
Oh,
school setting.
oh, interesting.
Yes, and there's a lot of pushback about that because you're seeing a lot of autistic kids that don't meet the criteria for that assessment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
So versus when we talk about medical diagnosis, we're talking about the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic statistical manual.
Hmm.
So that means that a clinical psychologist has done a battery of assessments, and they have determined per the DSM, your child has autism. The
Okay.
school can take that into consideration. The school can say, oh, you've done these assessments, then we'll do our assessments, and then say, yep, it lines up to us. So your category of eligibility is going to be autism.
Hmm.
Or they can say, okay, we'll keep that in mind. These are our assessments. Our assessments say social emotional developmental delay. That's what the IEP is going to be for.
Huh. Interesting. What about, is that different for the 504?
No, it's the same for the 504.
Same.
So in order to determine if a 504 is necessary, they conduct a special education evaluation, and the parent consent is required for this.
Okay.
They conduct this evaluation, and they might come and say, hey, we're not seeing the need for an individualized education program, but we are seeing the need for some accommodation. So they meet the criteria for a 504.
Okay.
And we're going to do the 504 under social emotional, or, if there's some executive functioning issues, which happen a lot with ADHD. So sometimes we'll see a lot of our ADHD kids that have a 504.
Mm-hmm.
And then they might just have a 504 their entire educational career,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
as the work gets more extensive, then they might end up being on an IEP based on how much support they need due to that diagnosis.
Okay. That makes sense. So if there's someone that's listening today and they're like, gosh, this might be beneficial for me to look into, what would be the first step for a parent?
The first step for a parent I recommend is you go to your district's website and look at special education.
Okay.
So if your child is already enrolled in school,
Yeah.
go to your child's website, go to the district for that, and look at what it says for special education. They are required per IDEA, which is federal law for special education. And then 504 is covered under the Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
So because of that, districts and states are required to say, this is our special education process.
Okay.
This is how we do this. This is how you request an assessment, all those things.
Okay.
If you don't, for some reason, you can't find it, sometimes websites are convoluted. They have a lot of stuff on there.
Yeah.
Then I would reach out to the special education. They should have like a coordinator, or they call them all different titles, but they're going to be the person that you'll see that they're like, if you have special education questions or issues, contact them.
Yeah. Okay.
Reach out to them and ask them, hey, what is your process for requesting a special education evaluation?
Got it. Okay. And is this just for public schools? What about private schools?
So private schools are a little different.
Yeah.
So when we talk about federal law and IDEA, that is referring to public schools.
Okay.
When you get into private schools, and it'll depend on the state, and it'll depend on where their funding comes from, what they fall under. They typically have a different type of IEP process.
Okay.
Because I want all my parents to remember, when we talk about IDEA and federal law, that's the Department of Education. And so that means public schools who receive funding from the Department of Education. So that matters, because when you talk about DODEA schools, so DODEA schools are for military children, and they're located on military bases.
Okay.
Now, not every military base. There's like a Southeast district. The only military bases where they are for sure located at everyone is overseas. So stationed in Germany, Italy, Korea, they're all going to them. And so DODEA is the Department of Defense Education Act. Okay. Those schools, they're funded under the Department of Defense.
Oh, interesting.
So they have their own set standard rules. And the best way I explain it is you have federal and you have IDEA, right? And then the Department of Education gets their funding from there. So every state that is under a public school, their program gets funding from the Department of Education. And so they're required to fall under federal law. But each state is able to determine their calendar timeline for assessment and all of that, right? Well, when you look at the Department of Defense Education Act and the DODEA schools, they fall under the Department of Defense.
Hmm.
So they line their things up with federal law and IDEA because they're federal.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually have it to where all of their schools, regardless of where located, if they're DODEA, have the exact same policy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that, that just means they have the exact same policy. So if you go
Yeah.
from one base to another base and they have that school, then your child's going to use the same
Yeah.
form,
Yeah.
how the policy works, but it doesn't mean that the standard of care is the same.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. I'm learning so much already. Okay. So this is a question that I feel like, is a question I personally want to ask, because I do feel like there's a lot of myths out there about IEPs and 504s that I hear. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, because you do this so much, what are some of the most common myths about IEPs and 504s?
I think some of the most common ones that I hear are if my child has a diagnosis, so we're talking about medical diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
they automatically
Mm-hmm.
qualify for IEP and 504. That's not true.
Yeah.
Again, it has to be impacting them in the school setting. Another myth that I hear is that, you can't, the diagnosis or the school diagnosis, so the school category of eligibility determines the services and supports. So I hear that a lot. So what I mean by that is I'll see a lot of my parents that have autistic kids.
Yeah.
They will get their child's autism diagnosis and then go, okay, what supports does my child need?
Yeah.
The supports that your child needed before.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say a lot, some schools or some staff, they will make it seem as if your child does not have this category, they cannot get the support.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if a parent's dealing with that, I always say go back to the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
The assessment is accurate and it's identifying that they need the support, or their grades are reflective, or their work is reflective. If my child is struggling to write sentences and you're telling me that they don't need some type of support, accommodation, or modification for that, very clear they do.
Yeah.
But I would say that those are the two biggest myths that I see where parents are kind of like, oh, or the last one would be it's too early or it's too late for me to get them on an IEP or a 504. So they haven't started school yet. I can't get them on an IEP or 504. That's not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're in high school now. I can't get them on an IEP or 504. That's not true.
Right. You can do it anytime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Our son is not even, well, he's starting kindergarten in the fall, but he's been on an IEP for the last 2 years and he's not even in kindergarten yet. So yeah.
Yeah. That, and then, and one more, because it's always coming to me, but another one is that a lot of parents don't know they can request an IEP meeting.
Right.
So even though their child's on an IEP, they're like, oh, well, we get one IEP meeting a year. And then every 3 years that we have reevaluation, we get an IEP meeting for that. And I'm like, no, you can request an IEP meeting at any time.
Yeah. Is that the same for 504? Can you request a 504? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what would be now that we're talking about the meetings themselves, what would be some tips that you would give to caregivers when they are stepping into, maybe it's their first meeting, but maybe it's not, and these are just some things that are good to think about?
I would always say, number one, bring support.
Okay.
I think a lot of people underestimate that. They feel like it has to be, and I was the same way when my son first we were getting into the special education process. Like they think it has to be their spouse or it has to be an advocate. Bring someone, your friend. If you trust your friend to hear what's going on in that meeting, bring them, because what it can feel like accidentally a lot of the time is them versus you. And sometimes that is the parent putting that on themselves because they feel like they're the professional and I'm here and I'm having to hear these things that may not always be what I want to hear, right? Yeah. About my child. So the first one is bring support. Again, your friend, your neighbor, your coworker. If you trust them to hear this information, bring them. The second thing is ask questions. Okay. If you don't understand something, ask questions.
Yeah.
That is what you're there for. That is what part of the process is. And sometimes they may not have the answer and they have to get back to you, and that's okay. But I think a lot of times as parents, again, we feel like we're not the professional in this
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, regardless of our role. Okay. I have clients that are teachers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you feel like as a parent, I'm not the professional, so I have to be a certain type of way and, be cordial and all those things, but you can ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, the other thing, aside from being an advocate, ask questions, would be you do not have to sign and agree to the IEP or 504 in that meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Can you talk more about that?
So I was, me and my husband were under that same impression too. We're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, we go in there, we're having this meeting, you give us these results, you tell us we're going to do an IEP. So we have to
Sign
sign the
it. Mm-hmm.
IEP, right? No. So how it's supposed to work, and depending on your relationship and how long you've been doing it and the situation, how it goes is they'll say, okay, we've completed the assessments, we got all these things in, we're going to bring you in, and they can call it different types of meetings because I've heard all different types of names in different types of
Yeah.
states.
Yeah.
So I'm not even going to give a name, but what it is the assessment results.
Yeah.
We've got the results, and we're going to let you know if we think that they, based on the assessments, they qualify for a 504, or they qualify for an IEP. And we're going to talk about what we think we should do and how we should proceed.
Mm-hmm.
So you come in, they do that, and then they say, okay, we're going to go with this. In this scenario, they say IEP. So they're like, we do see that based on our assessment, they qualify for an IEP. Would you like for us to, put an IEP in place?
Mm-hmm.
So you consent. Then in some meetings, depending on the meeting, they'll say, okay, so you've consented. We've drafted an IEP for you to review of what we think you'll need based on the assessment results, or let's talk about what services and supports you think that they'll need.
Yeah.
Either way,
Mm-hmm.
when that meeting ends, they'll say, okay, do you agree to this assessment?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you two scenarios I've encountered. One,
Okay.
my son's first one, we felt like we had to. We didn't know we didn't have to. So we're like, yeah, okay, that all sounds good, right? You're overwhelmed. You just heard the results. You just heard what they think. For us, we had stepped into the process after a lot had happened.
Mm-hmm.
So we were just thankful to finally have support in place.
Mm-hmm.
So we were just like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
And then he had a psychologist, and she reviewed it, and she's like, let's make some edits and some changes.
Yeah.
And they need to adjust this. And why are they doing this like this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to support him. And we're like, oh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Fast forward to a year later, different school because we're military, and we were getting his category changed. So his category was initially social emotional developmental delay.
Okay.
We came from Louisiana. They said he's not autistic. Okay. He had his medical diagnosis. They were like, no, he doesn't meet our criteria.
Okay.
He did.
Yeah.
But okay, we're moving, so I'm not going to argue with you.
Yeah.
So then his new school, they do their own assessments, their own observations. They hear our concerns, and then they go, so based on new results, we think his category should change to autism. Mm-hmm. Yes, we agree. This is what we've been wanting. So there was a difference in us going, yes. So then they were like, okay, so these are the supports we think he would benefit from because we've had him here, we've observed him, he already had an IEP. Mm-hmm. We were like, yeah.
Agree. Yeah.
We agree.
Where do we sign?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was two different instances though of and then we had our youngest choose on an IEP. He was entering into kindergarten, mm-hmm. and they did his assessment results. And I was way more I had brought it to them. I was like, I think he needs an IEP. Mm-hmm. And I went through the assessment results. At this point, this wasn't my first rodeo. Mm-hmm. I had already talked to Dad. Hey, you're not going to be able to be there. So he's like, if you think it's good, I'm in. Mm-hmm. Reviewed it, got there, went through all of it, asked any questions I may have. At this point, his case manager was already the case manager for his brother. Mm-hmm. So I already knew, you know what you're doing. I'd already worked with the staff before. I read it. I consented. Yeah. So 3 very different situations and experiences. And so that's why I tell parents, it's okay to say, I want to review this. And then they'll tell you, okay, well, can you get back to us by
Yeah.
this date? Because the goal is to implement it.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I always say, if you're overwhelmed, if it's your first time, if you're not familiar, you feel free to take it and review it and get some insight from. Most people have friends that are teachers, or, you know, like most parents have friends that are teachers, or whatever the case may be. You know, or you got it, or you have an advocate that just does IEP reviews. Like, go get that looked at and then
Or they contact you.
Yes. That part.
Which I will be linking how to find you. Yeah,
I do IEP reviews, and you know, and that's it's called a one-time IEP review, and basically someone brings their IEP, their child's IEP, I review it, and I'm like, hey, these are some areas based on what you're worried about that I feel like should be addressed, or these are some things that are not neuroaffirming. And then, you know, I draft up a nice, pretty document for them, and then they take it back, and like I've had clients like that too, where that's like the standard, just a one time, and then I have my clients that they have me for a year. So I have like year packages. So they have me for a year, and basically that comes with its own stuff. But we meet on Zoom, we go through their IEP, give feedback. I do help them do parent input, parent concerns. I also attend IEP meetings virtually.
Okay. I was going to ask that if you attend meetings with people.
I do. And I've actually, and just to give an idea, so I'm located in Georgia, but I operate nationwide. So I've like attended an IEP meeting in Colorado.
Okay. Do you find that you have to like brush up on what are that school districts and that state's policies and procedures before?
Yeah. So all of my clients, I do a free 30-minute consultation.
Okay.
And once they say, hey, yeah, I'm in, you know, purchase the package, I actually go to I get their child's school and grade. I go to that website and find out how their special education program runs.
Okay.
And then I go to their district website and find out how their special education program runs. Because it's important when you're looking at the state to see, what is your view on autism? What is your view on this service? Do you have, you know, some schools, they have their own SLP, so, you know, speech language pathologists. They have their own OT. They have their own PT, physical therapist, occupational therapist. Some schools, they don't.
Yeah.
Some schools have their own school psychologists. Some schools, the school psychologist is for the entire district.
Yeah.
So when we start looking at potential related services, so related services, for example, is like social work services, school counseling services. When we start looking at those services, what is it going to look like realistically to request that? And what are they going to feasibly be able to give? Because we don't want to just ask or request something and they go, yeah, we can do that. And then I go look and I'm like,
but can
you don't have an SLP at your school. So that would mean the SLP only comes on certain days, which means they only come for certain times. So is this really a feasible amount of speech services that you can provide to the child? So I do all of that legwork because I realize a lot of times parents, they're overwhelmed, you know?
Yeah. And we don't think to look at those specific details to see like, oh, well, they said that my child would get speech, but you don't think to look like, do we actually have that on site at our school? As a parent, we don't think about that. Yeah. So that's super helpful to have someone that is knowledgeable. Although I think what I hear you saying too is like, the more you do them, the more you start to learn. So, I would guess that maybe you don't work long-term with families.
So I've actually just started out within the last year.
Okay.
So a lot of the advocates that I've come across, they're seeing the kids through to graduation.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah. So it's just like, so basically how it tracks out is we offer the ability for you to say, I just need this one-time review. I don't have any issues necessarily with my kids' IEP team or their school or anything like that. Like we work well together, but I'm having a hard time really articulating what I would like to see in the IEP.
Got it. Okay.
So a lot of times people think of advocates like, oh, they're coming in because there's an issue or something's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
That doesn't have to be the case. Sometimes it's just simply, I'm looking for this to be reflective of this. Whatever those thises are, whatever your concerns are, I have a client who recently I draft a parent input statement for her. She was just like, look, I want these goals out of the IEP
Mm-hmm.
and I want these ones added. And I just need that to be articulated in a neural affirming way. And so we talk
Mm-hmm.
about neural affirming, we're talking about looking at autism, ADHD, and those neurodivergence,
Mm-hmm.
different from the medical model, looking
Yeah.
at them in a strengths way and that this person's brain operates differently, but how can we support them?
Yeah.
And so she was like, I just want, my child's neurodivergence to be supported. And I want to make sure that what's in her IEP benefits her. And so that's
Yeah.
what we did. Went through. I was like, okay, she didn't want this, and this,
Yeah.
but I want this, and this. And I drafted the letter for her for the school. And I identified like, this is what neural affirming is. This is what it looks like. And this is how we want it to look.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I do is I send it to you. And of course, you make any edits or changes that you want. You feel free to say you're working with an advocate or you're not. Some parents are like, I'm working with an advocate. They're coming to the meeting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some parents are just like, just keep it in the background, but like
Yeah.
they'll know when they read my stuff that I didn't write that. So
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
fine. It's whatever is supportive for you. And then you send it on to the team and we just go from there with if they're responsive, if they're not. And then I always include on my documents for my clients, it says at the bottom, please include this. It would say, please include this in Destiny's special education file.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. I also feel like what I'm hearing you say is it isn't always like a battle between the schools and the parents. It's maybe
mhm.
just that there is like we're speaking two different languages almost,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so to be able to learn each other's languages, to not see the IEP team, the teachers, the specialists, the principal as you just don't get my child. You're not supporting my child, but maybe just that they're speaking a different language.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I work with a lot of, well-trained advocates that they've even had the school be like, hey, can you do some PD? Or they've had
Mhm.
other members of the team kind of be like, hey, I have a kid in another grade at another school on an IEP that's my own personal child. And I like your approach. And that's the
Mhm.
thing is that I have a lot of educators that are friends and school psychologists that are friends and administrators that are friends. And that's the conversation that we have
Mhm.
in my family. Like my mom and my sister are educators.
Mhm.
And so the conversation that we have is that, you know, kind of how we always say presume competence when it comes to people,
Yeah.
presume that we're coming from a good place.
Yeah.
And, and I always come into a meeting until I see otherwise. I feel like we're all professionals here. And at the end of the day, our goal is the child.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think when you approach it that way, it's different because at the end of the day, this person is saying, I would like somebody that can be able to translate this, who's
Mhm.
been through this,
Mhm.
and help me articulate what I'm trying to say in a way that they understand.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you find that so I'm just wondering about the trauma piece of this. So we've talked a lot about different diagnosis. Um, but what about like kids from foster care that just have experienced a lot of, maybe not even from foster care, because that's the reality is like trauma is everywhere. But what about those kiddos that trauma is just really in their bodies so much so that they can't figure out how to, like, they can't be in the school setting and feel safe and still learn, and yet they're being labeled maybe the problem child, or maybe they're being labeled whatever. How does IEPs and 504s come into play with that?
So whenever I see anything like that, and so I was actually a reintegration case manager in Kansas for kids in foster care.
Okay.
And so the first thing I would always look at for my kids was that I had was their mental health diagnosis,
Mhm.
what medications they were on. Which a lot of times they were on too many medications
Mhm.
because they had been through many foster homes. And so it was like mental health services in this part of the state and then mental health services in this part
Yeah.
of the state and all the mess that comes with foster care
Yeah.
systems and things like that. But, when you talk about the IEP, you're really looking at my first thing is always like those related services. And when we talk about related services, we're talking about mental health services.
Okay.
I'm talking about social work services. I'm
Yeah.
talking about school counselor services, whoever is going to provide that peace to help them work through that trauma. And so what you just brought up is very interesting because when I worked, I had another therapist that I worked with when we were working for a children's advocacy center.
Mm-hmm.
Children's Advocacy Center, specifically, we were grant funded therapists to work with kids who experience trauma.
Mm-hmm.
We would have several instances where we would be asked by the parent for their child who had experienced trauma, or the foster parent or the biological parent or the caregiver to write a letter to the school explaining like this behavior is a direct result of their trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, we need to be more mindful of this and considerate of this and understanding of this. And how can we work to modify their work day or their school day? How can we support them?
Yeah.
So when I think about that, I think about the first part, which is that, for a better lack of words, the world is in a mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's been a big push lately too, is like the recognizing that mental health is so important, recognizing the importance of mental health in schools. So we had this big push, I feel like 5-10 years ago, about trauma informed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trauma informed. We need to be trauma informed.
Mm-hmm.
Now I think we've gotten to the point where we can recognize trauma, but we still don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, we don't know what to do.
We don't know how to support it. We still don't know what to do, but I can go, hey, that kid's traumatized.
Yeah.
So I think the first step is that if there's any, if you work in foster care, whether you're the case manager or the foster parent, is looking at the impact that this is all having on them educationally, and requesting a special education evaluation.
Yeah. So, so that's my question is like, what if we don't have a specific diagnosis, or maybe the diagnosis is like generalized anxiety or PTSD because they've been through trauma. And right. I shouldn't say just because that's big, but then, so we have that. Is this something where the caregiver, whether it's foster parent, grandparent, whoever is raising the child, can say, my child is not autistic. My child does not have ADHD. The child I'm raising does not have ADHD, but they've experienced a lot of trauma. They have PTSD. Can they be assessed for an IEP or a 504?
I'm going to tell you, a lot of individuals, caregivers, parents think that you even have to say all that, and you don't.
Okay.
My child is struggling.
Yeah.
In the school setting.
Period.
This child is struggling in the school setting. They're having a hard time. They're failing this class. They're skipping this class, depending on, what grade they're in. They're having school refusal. They're refusing to go to school because they're feeling XYZ.
Yeah.
I would like a special education evaluation.
Okay. Yeah. And that's it.
And then that's it. And then either they're going to say, hey, we have similar concerns, or they're going to say, okay, let's look. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll start looking at the data, right? So there's a lot of times schools will have a committee who will exist of whoever they decide that committee. So a lot of times if they have school psychologists, sometimes they'll have a diagnostician. It depends on what their role is, what their title is. And they'll go, okay, let's look at this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they look at it and this kid's having, straight A's, and there's no behavioral, no discipline referrals, things like that, they're probably going to write back and be like, hey, sorry, we're not seeing the need for it.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times, a lot of schools, whether formally or informally, I feel, have a thought process behind, we might want to do a special education evaluation here. We might want to see what's going on here. But as a parent, the caregiver, and you just have to be the individual that has legal rights to the child.
Yeah.
You can just say, hey, my kid's failing math, English, and science, and they don't want to come to school.
Yeah.
I think we need to do an evaluation, because I always tell parents, I recommend doing your research in the extent of like what you just said, providing that as context for why you feel that way. Mm-hmm. So if you're like, instead of saying they don't have this diagnosis, but saying, hey, they're doing these things, and I think that's a direct result of their trauma, because that adds to it. But just making the request, you don't have to justify having a diagnosis or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's helpful. Okay. So we're coming up on the end of our time, but I do have 2 more questions for you. So the first is, what do you wish more people asked about trauma?
what I wish more people asked about trauma is how they can support someone who's been through trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And have they addressed their own biases
Yeah,
about
that's
trauma?
good. That's good. Yeah.
Because I think that just like anything, we have this perception of what things will be. Everyone has a perception, a stereotype, a thought. When somebody says a word and it's like, oh, what's that? You know, you're like, oh, trauma. Like I have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of clients that will express like, this didn't happen to me, or this happened so many years ago, or I wasn't actually injured. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, that's why, they went and changed where you can get a PTSD diagnosis by witnessing someone
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
have something traumatic happen to them. And so my definition when I said trauma is a significant event that you feel has impacted you.
Mm-hmm. It's different for
That's what
everyone.
it is. And
Mm-hmm.
it's different for everyone. And an example I always give is you can have two people getting ready to cross a crosswalk. A car blows through it.
Mm-hmm.
One person is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they ran through that. Da, 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 right? They're just like annoyed or irritated. Let's keep going. Another person, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I almost just got hit by a car and they ran through this crosswalk,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe now I can't go to that crosswalk.
Yeah.
Maybe now I'm afraid of using crosswalks in general.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe now I'm afraid of that specific street while the other person is just like, what's going on? Like, this is the way we walk. Let's go.
Yeah. 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 That makes sense. Yeah. That's good. That's really good. Thank you. Okay. So then the last question is, what would be 3 resources that you would recommend to, let's make it specific to education, because that's what we've been talking about. 3 resources that you would recommend to those who are trying to help their kids in the educational setting.
I would recommend, first of all, that you go to the Department of Education website.
Okay.
That is a website that you need to have. It talks about IDEA, which is the Individual Disabilities Education Act, which
Okay.
applies to special education specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And then it talks about the Civil Rights Act, which applies to 504 specifically. So, they have the Office of Special Education Programs. That's a website that you need to go deep dive, research,
Okay.
all that joy and jazz.
Okay.
Another resource that I would say is COPA.
Okay.
So COPA is the Council for Parent Attorneys and Advocates, and their purpose is to educate you on federal law, educate you on IDEA.
Okay.
They have trainings, but they also have just where you can go in and ask a question, like, hey, I feel like maybe this part of IDEA is being violated, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to look at this, or I need an attorney, should it get to that route,
Mm-hmm.
you can, or I need an advocate. You can go on that website and you have this community where all these individuals are knowledgeable in that capacity.
Cool. Okay. Awesome.
And then, I obviously feel like I'm a resource.
Yes.
And
Love that. Okay. Yeah.
Destiny Huff Consulting is my website. And then my Instagram handle is Destiny Huff _ IEP advocate. But, I think my biggest push when I do these things is for parents to understand, like, you don't have to do this alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the scariest part is when you step into it or you just don't know. And then you realize there's this whole world that you never even stepped into. And so until my son went into special education, had an IEP, I did not have any focus on IEP and special education.
Yeah.
I knew I had worked in the school setting with educators and administrators and counselors in school setting before, but I was just kind of a support, and then I became
Mm-hmm.
the parent. And so that's a big thing that I was like, oh, this exists, but
Yeah.
all these resources exist too. And so that's what's great.
Yeah. Awesome. Yay. Thank you. Well, yes, definitely everyone needs to find you on Instagram, because I love the posts that you make. They're just good nuggets to think about, but also like good resources that you post about. So I would definitely second that you are a great resource.
Thank you. Yeah, and I always add into one of the things I like to add in at the end. I've started adding this at the end of my trainings and stuff that I do. Is that when you think about like those bias and things like that, just be mindful of them because,
Yeah.
for instance, I am late diagnosed autistic and ADHD,
Mm.
and a lot of people don't have that recognition that this is what that can look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Well, that's it. That's our time together. I really learned a lot from you, honestly. Like you're
I
amazing.
always
I
feel like
love
I word vomit because it's like so much
No,
information.
I know, and that's kind of what I wanted you to do because I feel like it is a lot of information and even I learned stuff and I feel like I didn't feel like I was the professional at it, but I felt like I knew enough, but I've learned a lot more. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing because with school starting soon, I think this is important conversation for us to be having. So thank you for your time and I hope you have a great
Thank
rest of
you.
your day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.